with a few announcements. My name is Dina Viviani, and I'm the programming librarian here at Brighton Memorial Library. And just to start, for safety purposes, if there is a need to evacuate the building, the door on my right, your left, is our closest exit. For anyone using a hearing aid, we invite you to take advantage of our induction loop system. It amplifies all sound coming through the microphone. And we ask that at the end, when we do Q&A, that you wait for this microphone to reach you so that everyone can hear and participate. Please silence or turn off your cell phones now so as not to disrupt the speaker. And we'd like to thank the Friends of Brighton Memorial Library for sponsoring this program and so many of the programs that we do. We have our January program brochures are back by the door. And we have some things coming up too that I'm pretty excited about, just because my daughter's been interested in birds lately. And we have winter birding in Rochester with John Bateman. That's on Friday, January 13th at 1 o'clock in this room. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to meet at the trailhead of the Brickyard Trail, and he's going to walk through and give us some space to look. And then we also have a Zoom program coming up, The Bald Eagle Back from the Brink. And this one is with the Montezuma Audubon Center director, and that will talk about the bald eagle population. So that one should be a great one too. And we have a lot of other stuff going on, so please grab a January program brochure over there with our books that are coming up for future BSIs. All right, and now about our speaker. Gary Craig is a member of the Democrat and Chronicle's Watchdog team and focuses on public safety and criminal justice. He has worked at Rochester newspapers since 1990, covering City Hall, politics, and federal courts before joining the newspaper's investigative team. He has won state and national investigative writing awards. Gary is also the author of 7 Million, A Cop, A Priest, A Soldier for the IRA, and the still unsolved Rochester Brinks heist, which was also made into a film recently. And he's the co-author with Deanne Quinn Miller of The Prison Guard's Daughter, My Journey Through the Ashes of Attica. And we have copies of both of those books also on the table if you are interested. He has done programs on both of those books here as well, and also has done a talk for us on news reporting in the 21st century. And he can often be found writing at the 12 Corner Starbucks. He is married and has 2 daughters. Thank you, Gary, for being here.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, Dean. I appreciate this. After Starbucks, this may be the place I am the second most. I love this library. I love this staff. They've been so good to me through the years with promotion and everything. And Dean and I were talking earlier. I'm the absolute worst marketer, so I appreciate her bringing the books out because I wouldn't have thought about that. I'm terrible at promoting my own stuff. So this is the book. I don't know how many have read it, Paradise Falls. Oh, good, good. For those of you who haven't, I hope you want to read it after this, because if not, I failed, because I was just on so many fronts, just found this book just marvelously written, marvelously told. The reportage was just incredible. But we'll get into all of that. The first thing I want to do, and to those of you who have read it, my apologies, this won't take long. To those of you who haven't read it, you will be reading this part. But I actually want to read just from the very opening, the introduction, because I got this book knowing that I was going to be doing this talk. And as I was reading along, I was kind of curious of what I was going to do. And just from the very first paragraphs of this book, it told me how I wanted to lay out this talk. So just a couple minutes, but this is the introduction. It's from May 14th of 1972, what happens on this day. And I'll probably paraphrase some here, kids skip a little. It was a Sunday afternoon, almost summer in Niagara Falls, and the children from the little bungalows on the east side of town scampered outside to play. The parents, mostly factory workers and housewives, didn't follow them. No adults were going to lord over the kids with rules and warnings that afternoon, because everyone knew the LaSalle neighborhood was safe, and everyone knew where the kids were going. To the playground, they called it, a rectangular expanse of open land around the elementary school between 97th and 99th Streets in the heart of the neighborhood. There were some play structures there, a swing set, a slide, a baseball diamond too, but mostly the grounds were wild, nearly 16 acres of grassland growing in clumps untended and untamed. Parents sometimes wondered why no one had developed a property to drop in among the tidy rows of single-story starter homes. It seemed as if someone should have built a real park there years ago. I'm just going to come back to this part in a moment. Debbie Gallo, 11 years old with dark hair and hazel eyes, wasn't sure what to believe about the fire rocks. What I skipped over, I should, was there are these stories from older boys who rode their dirt bikes in tight shorts and white tube socks, telling fantastic tales of rocks at the playground that burst into flames that spontaneously combusted. And Debbie Gallo had heard these stories but wasn't sure what to believe. Her father was a welder, a son of Italian immigrants and a Korean War veteran who walked with a limp from the shrapnel that had carved up one of his knees. The Gallos felt fortunate just to own a home in the neighborhood, and Debbie felt lucky that it was this one, 97th Street. And then there's a description of the home, how much fun the kids had playing at the playground, and this particular day, May 14th, 1972. It was warm and windy, a spring storm was coming, but Debbie and her girlfriends paid the weather, and the boys around them no mind. While the boys churned up dust at the playground with their bicycles, clattering here and there on narrow paths carved into the high grass, the girls set about creating something pretty, sidewalk art. At their feet, they began gathering chunks of rock to use as chalk. The rocks were soft and white, the whitest white I'd ever seen, Debbie would later say. And best of all, they were easy for the girls to find amid the topsoil. Debbie took one in each hand, ran them between her fingers, and then got down on her knees to draw on the concrete. Later, she couldn't remember how much time elapsed before her eyes began to burn. Had she been playing with the rocks for 5 minutes or 15 seconds? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that rubbing her eyes only made them worse. As she pulled her hands away, the pain came on like a wave, hot and searing. Her eyes burned as if from the inside, and then she was screaming and she was running, stumbling across the playground, trying to find her way back to her house on 97th Street through a haze of tears and gauzy darkness. It wasn't just the pain that worried Debbie at this point, it was the panic growing inside her, panic over a realization that was hard to explain to her mother back at home. Debbie Gallo couldn't open her eyes, she couldn't see. For one brief and scary moment, she was blind. That's the introduction to the book right there. I mean, very powerful, very compellingly written. And it told me right away how I wanted to talk about the book with you guys, because I was asked here to sort of talk about it as a reporter as well as a reader. And first, I do want to speak of it as just a reader, just like everyone here is reading it. Second, I want to sort of dissect a little more as a reporter, one who's been, as Yer said, doing the job a long time, since 1981 now. I'm the last person at the Rochester Democrat Chronicle who actually worked at the Times Union. So that's, for better or for worse, I'm not sure. And so I want to talk to that as a reporter, because the reportage of this is just, to me, just really pulled me in as well as the story did. And I've never reported on something with sort of the environmental consequences of Love Canal and the national consequences of Love Canal. That was central to really the birth of the Superfund in many ways. But through the years, I've done environmental reporting. I've done reporting on figures who were up against forces, that were pushing back hard, and they were trying to get the truth out, which is central characters in this book. And then even beyond that, kind of want to look at it a third way. Hopefully we'll get to that. I don't want to prattle on, because make sure we have time for questions. And talk about it even more in depth as a reporter, with stories that I've done that do seem to me to somewhat parallel what happened here, but again without the significance of something that gave birth to EPA. And in one way, Dina was kind enough to mention the book that I co-wrote with Dee Quinn Miller, The Prison Guard's Daughter. And Dee came up against many of the same forces that that some of the characters in this narrative, Paradise Falls, do, government and other, that really pushed back. And Dee was constantly sort of fighting this uphill battle, trying to get the truth about Attica. And there were points in this book where I was reading and I was thinking of Dee. Some other things that sort of resonated with me is I did some reporting years and years and years and years ago, even before I got here, which still to me was actually my favorite reporting I've ever done. It was hard, which was on the military's electromagnetic pulse testing. That really sounds arcane, I know. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with that, because this is what we're here to talk about. When I say EMP later when we talk about it, that's what I'm talking about, electromagnetic pulse testing. And the environmental reporting and kind of what was attempted to be covered up here reminded me of the months and months and months, actually probably a year or two, I spent on that a long time ago, actually back in 1989, I think, yeah, 89. So that's kind of the three ways I wanted to dissect this. For those of you who don't know, probably most of you do, but just a really quick synopsis of Love Canal. It was early in the 20th century, envisioned this sort of dream community. It's going to be between the upper and lower Niagara rivers, near the falls, and it never came to be. And it basically ended up being purchased by a company called Hooker Chemical, which years and years and years later would be bought by Arm & Hammer Occidentals, the owner of Occidental Chemicals, etc. And for many years it became a dumping ground for pollutants and trash and garbage for Hooker Chemical, which did all kinds of stuff, from plastics to other things through the years. And was working with chemicals that we learned a lot more about as the years had passed, and just being dumped there and leaching into the water and damaging the soil and everything. And eventually, Hooker just covers the property, all this, these hazards that have been buried there, barrels and barrels and barrels, and some has just been dumped willy-nilly, and sells the property to the city for Niagara Falls for $1. Turns out not to be a good deal. As hard as that is to believe. And then what happens? They build a school on top of it, of all things. So. And years pass, but there are these stories that you hear, these things that are kind of these omens and these harbingers of troubles there, like Debbie Gallup and what happened to her just with her eyes. So again, I want to talk to you, reader, reporter, and then more detailed reporter, but I just kind of want to come back to one little section that I kind of skipped over in the opening, and just read that. It's just a few sentences. It seemed as if someone should have built a real park there years ago, but the children asked no questions because for them the land was perfect. The vacant lot to end all lots, a place filled with possibility and maybe even magic. The older boys, straddling their dirt bikes in tight shorts and white tube socks, told fantastic tales of rocks at the playground that burst into flames and spontaneously combusted. They said they'd seen it with their own eyes. And right, you're in the opening paragraphs of the book, and already you're just being pulled in as a reader. The writing is just so taut and compelling, and it's. It made me think of childhood in a way, short of rocks blowing up in front of me, thankfully. But just this beauty of this playground area where kids would just gather. I lived in North Carolina, and we, in a suburban community where we had a vacant lot nearby that we created a baseball diamond out of, and played baseball there. If you hit the ball over the fence, you had to navigate the electric fence into the horse pasture to get the balls. I don't know if you've seen the movie Sandlot, but it was a lot like that. But and so just reading that kind of took me back to childhood. It was so well written, riding around on bikes, etc., not a care in the world in the summer. You feel the joy or this magic of childhood. But there's also, well, if you know the history, while you read the book, something's coming. You know that already. But you don't really know what it is, and you don't really expect it to be this poor girl, being dashing to her home because she feels like she's been blinded. And these stories of rocks combusting, etc. And you're reading this, and something's amiss, and then boom, he hits you with that. It wasn't just the pain that worried Debbie at this point; it was the panic growing inside her, panic over a realization that was hard to explain to her mother back at home. Debbie Gallo couldn't open her eyes. She couldn't see. For one brief and scary moment, she was blind. And that's just, right away, you've gone from the magic of childhood to, there's these stories that might not or might not be true, probably just kids making stuff up, to boom, this poor girl, feeling like she's lost her eyesight. And the writing there, just as a reader, short of the reportage, which we want to get into, just to me, it was so compelling, and it continues that way throughout the book. Just to show you, I was like dog ear in places I want to talk about, so I'm not going to do that, trust me. If you can see this, you can see there's probably 2/3 of the book are dog ear, because there's so much with it when I was reading. And so having sort of decided that laid out the way I wanted to talk and the way I wanted to read the book, I went back to it again. But the other part of that, to come back to the reporter part, that just jumped off the page with me too, is when you're reading these, probably it's 2 pages, it's maybe 12 paragraphs, there's a lot packed in there, and it's told so neatly and confined and not a wasted word that if you're a reporter, you know how much went into that. You know, as a reader, it's easy to kind of just read it so quickly and not realize how much research went into just making those paragraphs accurate and to making sure they're right. And I started for the fun of it, just like how many facts checks. And just after the third paragraph, stopped at a couple dozen, because I just knew how much. And then not only that, you're talking about, it'd be one thing if you're talking about something that happened last week, but you're talking about something from the date of May 14th, 1972, which stunned me in and of itself, because how did he know it was May 14th, 1972? I mean, you know, I went to the hospital as a kid multiple times with scrapes and things like that. You know, what happens is she just goes and gets her eyes washed out and she's fine. I don't think my family has the records of me going to the hospital when I was 11 years old. You know. But it turns out, and it is explained here a little bit, is that even then, you know, there were some concerns about the place, and Hooker Chemical and health department officials were keeping some records of incidents that were happening there. And you know, he talks about that. Hooker's man returned to the plant that afternoon after he got the story of what happened, and writes a report on the eyes of Debbie Gallo, and says across the top of the page in large black letters, confidential, though a copy went to the company's insurance department. And so as a reporter, what I often do when I'm reading nonfiction, and I find myself just blown away by the level of detail, is it's maddening because I don't like to do it while I'm reading, but sometimes I have to, is I go to the footnotes. I just can't help myself. You know, and it turns out, you know, the footnotes, for the introduction basically include the record. You know, the record, he found that record from 1972, the safety supervisor, you know, of what had happened. So he had all those details. He talked to Debbie Gallo. He talked to Debbie Gallo's mom. And the other thing that jumped out at me as I was reading the book, because there's a lot of central characters in this book that we'll discuss. Debbie Gallo kind of disappears after this. She shows up one more time in the book, just as kind of a footnote, not a footnote like the footnote at the end of the book, but kind of a sort of a time frame of this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And you know, and it's this wonderful way to open the book, but she's not even a central character. She's a very peripheral at best character, and it gives you this sort of powerful opening. And again, as I said, to me, just the details in those couple of pages. I mean, even the weather. I mean, it's a little thing. But you know, warm and windy, a spring storm was coming. You know, I mean, the beauty of online now is you can go back and plug in a date and find out the weather for there then. But still, it's a lot of time, and you want to double check it, etc. Oh, one thing, I'm going to take a quick diversion in case people haven't heard. Speaking of online, I'm on Twitter a lot, for better or for worse, but there are reliable sources on Twitter. I tend to source them out. There was a report from a reliable NFL source shortly before we were doing this that DeMar Hamlin, everybody's heard good, that DeMar Hamlin was breathing better during the night and woke up and seemed to know the doctors and his family around him. So maybe you've already heard that, but in case you hadn't, I just saw it before. So I was very happy to see that. So, but back to the point at hand, sorry. Sounds like everybody knew that already, so you guys are way ahead of me, and I thought Twitter was first. Little did I know. So there's the reporting part of that, and then to kind of even go further into sort of what I've done as a reporter, you know, here, there, and yon. The EMP stuff that I mentioned was just, it took a lot of work, and again, a little bit more with documents. There was so much with documents where I was trying to rebuild this history of electromagnetic pulse testing at a facility in Northern Virginia that turned out to have some environmental hazards, and as it turned out, could damage what are known as fly-by-wire aircraft, which is, like the technical part of it, is most jet airliners these days. And the facility happened to be right in the path of what now is Reagan National Airport, was then National Airport. So it's kind of problematic, you know, other than the possibility of knocking flights out of the air. There was no concern. And reading about the documents and how he chased these down, you know, sort of gave me these flashbacks of chasing down the EMP related stuff, which if we get to time, I want to talk mostly about the book. If not, yeah, don't worry about it, ask me about it later. Dee's story, same sort of thing. Dee's story, he couples the story of people with records in a way that's almost just so fluid and seamless that you probably don't even realize how much records are forming the foundation of it. Like that one thing I read, you don't really even get a sense, probably wouldn't even know reading it, how much of that is just driven by the records. And with Dee's book, which Dina was kind enough to mention, there was a lot of records that we relied on to rebuild her memory and other things. I mean, she had a pretty distinct memory of things, but there were a ton of records that we were sharing when we put that book together back in 2021. So, coming back to sort of first, now I'm going to backtrack and go through all these sort of kind of as a reader. This is a book about environmental catastrophe. If you haven't read the book, I'm sure you know that. It's about these strong-willed individuals who fight back and try to get the government to do the right thing and are often up against government intransigence and corporate intransigence and sort of government and corporate kind of union and collaboration that makes the intransigence even worse. And the people who really push back hard, Lois Gibbs becomes the most known of those. She becomes a central character and kind of the leader, she is the leader of the environmental activism movement that it sort of keeps things going. As a matter of fact, there's a TV movie made about her. And while records are a big part of this, it's really the people that he focuses on, the Lois Gibbs and others. And what I admire too was, while he tells the story of Lois Gibbs, he finds others that I think whose stories have not really been told in much detail before. And it's funny, as thinking about this book over the weekend, I hit this column in the New York Times about the Trump presidency. It's a really great column if you get a chance to go back and read it. It's about books being written about the Trump presidency. They compared it with the Maggie Haberman book, with The Decider and some others. And it said, when journalists write books on the presidency of Donald Trump, they tend to choose one of three options. They write about personality, they write about paper, or they write about people. And it's easy to kind of like, I'm going to use one or the other. I'm going to do the documents, or I'm just going to do the people, and just take their word for things. Whereas the best way, the more kind of, I think the more accurate way, is if you can merge the two, which is what Keith O'Brien does so well here. And I was reading it, and it reminded me so much. I don't know if people have read Civil Action or seen the movie of Civil Action, about the water pollution in a town in Massachusetts from the book and the movie from years ago. And sure enough, Jonathan Harr, the author, what to me is still one of the best books of this sort, is the very first person with a blurb on the back of the book. It just reminded me of just Civil Action. And this is kind of falls into what's been called narrative nonfiction. I mean, there's nonfiction, but narrative nonfiction are those books that you want, that are designed to kind of read as a novel, that that you really sort of propel the reader through and want to keep them going. And that's where this falls. And as well as reading the book, I always want to go back and see what others are thinking. And I read one review that really made a good point that I hadn't thought of as I was reading it, is how compressed the story is. He picks the years of the activism and really, you could have told the story sort of more like, okay, Hooker Chemical starts here, well, Love Canal starts here with all these dreams, Hooker Chemical comes along, here's what they do, the town does, the city buys this, and you could have told it in this sort of chronological way, but instead, you get all that, but you're not sort of weighed down by it. He finds ways to sprinkle it into the story where you learn it, but it's not so sort of kind of weighting the story down and becoming such a part. There's not chapters about Hooker Chemical. He could have easily done that. There's not chapters about the birth of Love Canal, which he could have easily done. But instead, you get all that same information, but he really compresses it in this narrow time frame, practically speaking, where the bad stuff really becomes apparent, even though there were years before it, and the government finally gets involved after refusing to do so forever. And that, I think, really helped tell the tale too. But he couldn't have done that without the research that he'd done and the cooperation that he got and the documents that he got. And that was just, to me, that just really made the book all that much more compelling. And then the other part that's beautiful about the book is really a book about strong women. People who unfortunately have been sort of nixed out of our history for so long. And really, the most sort of, everybody in this book who comes out, they're government officials who do the right things are men, but the ones who really come out showing this sort of strength, admirable strength, are the women. We mentioned Lois Gibbs, and she really, she gave up a lot. I mean, she really fought tooth and nail once she realized what was going on, and the government was so hesitant to admit to it. And she was up against Hooker Chemical, and they were always pushing back. And she's just a housewife. Don't believe her. What does she know? And she was just an admirable character. But there were others who came through, and if you read the book, I'll mention them, you know whom I speak. If you haven't, I really, again, advise that you do. There was a state health official, Beverly Pagen, who began to recognize early on that the sicknesses, the illnesses that they were seeing there, and the rate at which they were seeing were uncommon. I mean, the tough part of this, and I've done some environmental reporting through the years, not as much of late, and you have my good friend Steve Orr, who lives here in Brighton, who's retired from the DNC, was a great environmental reporter. I always admired his work, and we would talk about this when things would pop up. There can be anomalies. That's just the reality, like anything else. There can be cancer clusters. It's just, the reality is sometimes there can be clusters of illness that don't really have an environmental cause. It's just the way the numbers happen. And it's so hard sometimes to kind of parse that out with what is environmentally caused and what isn't. And of course, those who want to say, typically those who are at fault, say there is no environmental nexus here, they're going to point to that, yes, there are clusters all over, but you can't make the definitive statement, without really hard evidence that shows this chemical and this illness, et cetera, and there's this real connection. But Beverly Pagen, the state health official, just saw early on whether there was miscarriages, or there's little things like the eyes burning, whether there were more severe illnesses that were happening, that just the rates and how it seemed to be so centered. Is that me? I'm sorry. Can you make it any worse? Okay. Sorry about that. Move my head less. How it just seemed beyond anomalous. It just seemed like there was nothing that could be at the root of this short of the chemicals and everything else that were buried there. And she began working with the activists and helped them. There were swales that were known there, and they were really even better able to pinpoint the activists in the community. Many of them housewives started doing questionnaires, working with Beverly Pagen, finding out what the numbers were and how they really seemed to even coincide more deeply and with specific areas. And she just, it pretty much cost her job. I mean, had she not been so probably well respected, I mean, they kept, the Department of Health people in Albany kind of just kept saying, no, there are other reasons. They were working to push her out to the point where she was fighting. She didn't set out to be a whistleblower. She just wanted to do the right thing. And she's another character in this book that comes out just as this picture of strength, especially with her job at risk, and it keeps getting worse for her as the story progresses. And then there's this woman, Luella Kenny, who loses her son, who, and it's just, and they tell the story of his childhood and her as she watches constantly. Every time you think this poor kid has turned the corner and he's home and he's enjoying life, something goes wrong again and he's back in the hospital and everything's just, pardon my language, going to hell. And this poor kid, and it's just each time, and again, the storytelling, because you keep returning to this and you're like, oh, hopeful, and then you're not. And then it, sadly, sorry to give away that part of my apologies for that. But she is a central character who also takes up the fight. And these are two people that, through the history of Love Canal, you go back and read Luella Kenny, you read of her because of what she lost. And Beverly Pagen, to a degree, if you go back and, I'm sure the articles highlight some of her work, but not as much kind of this sort of the more public storytelling of this that came later, and a lot did. There's been films, there's been other books, etc. I think these were people who were really central and, and just have not been recognized to the degree. Luella Kenny, there's, to me, this incredibly powerful scene, which Keith O'Brien, to me, is masterful at stretching out these things where you want to know what happened, and then got to wait another, because he's doing it chronologically, and there's this, where she is going to the, the annual shareholder meeting of Occidental, and Arm & Hammer is going to be there. And she's actually going with these nuns who really want to take up this fight and some other things that Occidental has been involved in. And Occidental does everything it can to like shut them down from even speaking at the shareholders meeting. She's never done anything like this before. And it's written so well. You feel her nerves, in the days before, just the nervousness as she gets there and all. And of course, they then just pretty much, they welcome her and nod and say, oh, thank you. Then they dismiss her and basically tell them why they're all wrong. Not a surprise at all. But it's those things and the way, even little details of this book, whether it's Lois Gibbs, whether it's Luella Kenny, where the strains that get put on their families come through so much in this book. Just little details again, such as dishes not getting washed, clothes not getting washed, kids not getting the attention that they usually do, because they become so committed, and understandably so, because they're still living on this property and they're fighting for the government to buy their homes. And they don't really have enough to just like up and move. Some do, some up and move and go, but not everybody does. And it just turns the world upside down. And one second here, just one other part. I'm marked here on my many dog-eared pages. And this is while talking about John Allen, who is the son of Luella Kenny. But the hard summer, in and out of the hospital, swollen and sick, had stolen a bit of innocence from John Allen. The boy wasn't sure what to believe anymore, a change noted by everyone during his stay at Children's Hospital in August. As nurses moved in to draw blood and take his vitals before yet another round of incessant tests, he looked different. Patient very upset and nervous, they noted in his chart. Quote, irritable and crying. Quote, color pale. John Allen was afraid. And that chapter ends, and then you go back to Governor Carey and others who are trying to decide what to do about this. And he weaves these stories in so wonderfully. And another thing he does, which is kind of the narrative nonfiction, which is a trait of fiction, is many of the chapters are very short. The chapters are only 4 or 5 or 6 pages in here sometimes. And it is like with that, he leaves you with this cliffhanger. And I really feel bad that I gave that away now. But still read. But in these sort of scene setters or these questions that you just want to know, it's kind of like the detective story. It just ends on this moment where I got to read the next chapter, and then going chronologically, he'll take you somewhere else and be like, oh, what happened? What's going on? And then you'll get back to it, and it flows so well. It's the way the book does. And we also get into unsurprisingly, when you're talking about stories of community and pollution, issues of race and social strata. I think early on, and probably the reporting of Love Canal, just like the reporting of everything else, this was ignored. But we now know that sadly, environmental pollution, like so many other things in our society, often track along income level and race. That's where things often end up. And even though sort of the immediate community here was kind of a middle to lower middle class community, to use those terms, there was an apartment building that was mixed. It was white and black folks, and I don't think there was really a large Hispanic population at the time, of lower income, but largely working class families. And there were these efforts to move families off the property, that was close by and being impacted. And this high-rise was showing effects too. And they were just being forgotten. In the mix of everything, they had just been forgotten. And the families who were doing, Lois Gibbs, for all she did, she had not thought about the impact on these families in that place. And it was, racism, whatever it was, who knows. But she wasn't alone. And finally, this woman, Eileen Thornton, and she comes into the book, that's what I was trying to find, and just this marvelous description of her. Thornton was one of the longest tenured residents of Griffin Manor, which is the complex I'm speaking of. The single black mother, almost 40 years old in the summer of 1978, had lived in the housing development off and on for more than 20 years. She was well known among residents. She cut quite a figure on the path of the development, a small woman at just 4'11", and she was something of a permanent fixture at ladies' night in the local bowling alleys. And this description, you could stop there. Okay, she's a regular bowler. That's really cool. But no, amid the smoke and the haze at the Pine Bowl or Beverly Lanes, there was Thornton gliding across the polished maple floors, throwing strike after strike. The woman knew how to do it all, how to address the ball, how to follow through, and even how to pick up the dreaded 6-7-10 split, with the pins standing like goalposts in the far corners of the lane. But somehow Thornton had missed it, and she too, I mean, she acknowledges that she had not paid attention to the news and realized that what was going on, nearby was being linked to something else. And nobody else had bothered to sort of come to them. But she becomes this incredibly strong figure, pushing back and fighting and making sure the residents of this complex are not forgotten in this whole thing. And you really begin, as this reader, and I'm still kind of focused just on the reader, as I said I would, you begin to feel the frustration mounting in you, just as it does with everybody, because just they're constantly, as they're trying to get the government to do the right thing, all of them are getting this pushback. The corporate pushback, the government pushback from Albany, some, DC is trying to make some headway, but everybody's like, we don't have any money, we can't do anything, what else can we do? Actually, it's interesting, for those of you who remember, John LaFosse, he shows up a lot in this book, because it's interesting to me, whereas his staff early on, there's some people in his staff that really tried to address this early on, the Buffalo area congressman who had some areas of Monroe County too. And I was impressed with some of the folks with his staff, women again, who really were taking up the case of the folks that lived in Love Canal. And in the book, again, I don't want to tell too much because some of you haven't read it yet, but there was a scene there to me that just, it reaches this, like, for the activists who are trying to get this taken care of. Again, what they largely want is just move us out of here, buy our homes, help us relocate, just because we can't do this on our own. Some who are able did. And there comes this scene where they take 2 government officials hostage. I mean, it's just, but it's almost like comical. I mean, when you read it, this is like, the zenith of like, oh my God, what are we doing? Like one of the guys, one of the 2 government officials is like just friendly with Lois Gibbs. They're very chatty, and she's worried about him because he feels like he can walk out at any time. But there are crowds outside this facility. She is truly worried what might happen if he goes out and nobody's talked to them. But you can feel her like, what is it? It's come to this? I have just taken government officials hostage and I'm kidnapping them. Well, I guess kidnapped, but you know where they are. But, and it's just, to me, it reads in such a way, it's like, oh my gosh, it builds up to this so well. And again, there's humor in it, there's tragedy in it, and you can feel everybody's sort of, we're at wit's end, and we don't know what to do now. It's come to this, we can't get what we want. And you really feel that frustration as it's going along. It's this sort of visceral kind of strain that is put in the family. And as I said earlier, the one thing that really jumped out at me is O'Brien's just intense focus on the people. There's intense focus on the people. You get the EPA Superfund is born. You get a little bit of history of the pushback by both government and corporations against some portions of the government, some of the corporations against the Superfund, how it's on and off. And you realize how significant this story is in the whole environmental movement of the U.S. Is it the first moment of environmental significance? I would probably argue that if you go back to Rachel Carlson's book, Silent Spring in 1960, 61, 62, that's really sort of one of the stopping off points. There's probably many before that you could find, but this is clearly a book of, an incident, the whole Love Canal tragedy, that is surely a key point in that issue of environmentalism. So that having prattled on, I do that. Let me check the time again. Oh my God, 12:38. How did that happen? I'll be very quick. Does anybody want questions now before I get to talk about the reporting and other stuff? Because if not, I don't want to stop people with questions. I can zip through. I'm not very good at testing these things. I just have this habit of rambling. Okay, so kind of get to the part that's the reporter part of me reading the book, and it's the level of detail I mentioned, and just to me when I read it, just the documentation and how he just wove the story of the people with these just incredible details. Because when you're trying to do sort of nonfiction telling and narrative nonfiction storytelling, it's the details that really, really matter. It's the little things that sort of jump off the page. And when you read it, you don't even really notice it sometimes but it just adds so much. It just illuminates the story so much. But it's work. I can tell you, as a reporter, it's work. You got to ask those questions. You can't trust the memory of Debbie Gallo, somebody who was 11 years old in 1972. So you hope maybe when you're talking to her mom, that she's going to give you something similar, that you can sort of coincide the stories. That then if, my gosh, if you're dogged enough to find the record of the 1972 incident that even adds more, what was said and told back then you've really got it, because it's at that moment, here's the record of what happened. And as a reporter, throughout this book, I was just constantly sort of, wow, this detail. I know how much work it took him to get this detail. And I appreciated that so much. I don't know how many of you are fans of Robert Caro. Robert Caro wrote The Power Broker. He wrote the LBJ. We're all hoping he gets his 5th book written before he's not unable to. And there's a documentary coming out it's supposed to be this month at the Little, which I can't wait to see, with Robert Caro and his editor, Robert Gottlieb, just about the work. Robert Caro, is like one, I felt like I should have done it with this book, is like one nonfiction author who I read with 2 bookmarks. This is because the reporting part of me is, I bookmark like everybody else where I am in the book when I go to bed at night, and I bookmark where I am in the footnotes. Because I'm constantly going to the footnotes saying, how the heck did he find this out? And this book was the same way. It just, and I was, that reporting part of me just kept, I had to know more, And, the way it's told chronologically also makes the most sense. I don't know if any of you know Sebby Wilson Jacobson. Sebby was a Times Union, the DNC reporter editor, one of the best editors I ever had. She was the projects editor when I joined the investigative team. And Sebby always helped me sort of, like when I would do sort of narrative nonfiction projects, so to speak, which may be a story that covers multiple days, just sort of, okay, who are the key figures? Let's focus on them, and let's do it chronologically, because for the reader, it's often, easier that way. And to tell you the truth, it's easier sometimes to tell the story that way. You still have to get the details and all, but instead of sort of trying to bounce back and forth, it's sometimes easier just to tell the story that way. So that the organization of the book, it captivated me too as a reporter. There's also one of the characters who shows up throughout, young man Michael Brown, was a 26-year-old when this started, Niagara Falls Gazette reporter. And he becomes, because he's really one of the first ones to take this story to heart and report on it. And his story fascinated me. He's actually written a book about it, which I want to go back and read. I haven't. And it's interesting to me because this eventually becomes a national, even international story. And so, there's obviously the Buffalo News, which is a bigger paper than the Niagara Gazette. The New York Times gets involved, the Washington Post, everybody's reporting on it. But, this guy, Michael Brown, having been there at the outset, is one who is often breaking the stories. He's the one the activists trust. He's the one that when the state thinks they have a response that answers things, they send him information because they assume he's being fair. And he's not a prominent character in the book, but he's prominent enough. Just his work, I was very interested in what he did. And I'd heard of him. I'd heard about he sort of built this reputation. But he actually got out of journalism, and he and his wife are very faith-based, and they've got I think a website. And I really just want to sort of go back and read the book that he wrote on this, because as a reporter, I'm curious. He was doing the day-to-day, and then you now have this long view of history. And as one of the things that as a reporter, it's no secret to everybody here that we have a much smaller staff than we did when I started. and we're not alone in that. TV stations do too, I can tell you, radio stations do too. And it's often frustrating. And so, I'm not saying anything out of school, my editors know how I feel. And we've had to sort of redesign the way we approach things. We're not at meetings all the time. Though the beauty now is at least you can see meetings online and watch them if you need to. But even that is not the same as being there and being able to corral the person after who you want to talk to about things. And it just reminded me of just kind of that on-the-ground reporting where you're just, it's like any job. What's the old saying, 90% of it is just being there or whatever it is. And that just adds to the reporting so much because you're there and you're watching and you're listening and you're talking to folks and you're getting the documents, what are being churned out. And it just helps so much kind of build the story. Even if you're working towards something months and months and months later, it just helps you build that. And and now we're more like sort of Time magazine, where we're trying to gather up stuff and then build it for a bigger story later. But it's not the same as kind of being on the ground and there at the planning board or the town board or the city council, the courtroom or whatever, and just getting those moments that you can't get in those individuals who will talk to you that you can't get without that. The other thing that jumped out to me is he wrote this book during the pandemic while his kids were being homeschooled and studying and all. I had some sympathy because Dee and I, quite a lot of sympathy, but Dee and I did The Prison Guard's Daughter in 2 months during the pandemic. That was crazy because the publisher wanted it for the 50th anniversary of Attica. And we're like, the good thing was we were friends. I knew her story well. I knew it going into it, but there's a lot I didn't know. And she and I, we went through it chronologically. We said, okay, you're 6, tell me the story. I knew the story some. I would write a chapter, she would tell me, I would send it back to her, she would edit it, send it back to me, we'd go back and forth. And it was tough. There were, the better part of, the one thing that I could say was sort of during the pandemic, we got into a rhythm with it. We figured out how to do it, and it probably because they had such a narrow time frame, a narrow window when they wanted the book done. In some ways, it probably helped because Dee lives in Batavia, and we probably would have gotten to that anyway. We're just, it's just going to take us too much time to drive back and forth to Batavia and Rochester and talk and go through, all these years of your life. So we probably would have gotten to that anyway. But the pandemic kind of drove. But I can't imagine with the research that he did on this book, trying to do it during the pandemic with all the stresses. He talks about that in the acknowledgments and the afterwards and all. And just kind of getting back to the specific reporting part, then I'll shut up because we're almost at one. Dee, Lois Gibbs, her part in there that I saw that made me think so much of Dee, because Dee came up against some of the same obstacles. It's a very different story. She was trying to find the truth of her dad's death, the truth of what happened with the uprising. She became very prominent as Forgotten Victims of Attica group, but she never, it wasn't something she chose. She did not set out to say, I'm going to be this activist who's going to find myself fighting with the government to get records unsealed and things done and truths told. And that in many ways is Lois Gibbs in this case. And just in this way, that sort of reminded me of her. She became in some ways the lead spokesperson, which she did, for the Forgotten Victims of Attica, much like Lois Gibbs became the lead spokesperson for the residents and all who were fighting this. Many times she fought against the state. They tried to shut her down many times. There were documents that were publicly available that she could not access for a while because they were just pushing back against her. And similar to what we saw with the pushback here. And those records, when we spoke and all, were just a gold mine for me because her memory is like everybody else's memory. It's especially you're talking about 6-year-old, but even of stuff a couple of years, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's faulty. Mine is. I had an incident like a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, at the office where I was standing over an editor, and he had a story up about a funeral home director whom I knew, who had a funeral home on the west side of the city and often, sadly, had dealt with victims of violence. He was sort of known to handle victims of violence. And I said, oh gosh, I wonder how she's doing. I wonder what happened to her. So I went back to my desk, opened up. She had died, there was an obituary, and I had written it. So you talk about memory lapses. I can fully relate. It hadn't been that long ago. It was probably like 3 years before this thing. It's like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I won't get into the EMP reporting because we only have so much time left. I can just tell you that this reminded me in the way of trying to deal with reporting. What happened, as I told you, there were a lot of whistleblowers with this EMP stuff. They got this military base shut down. The records were voluminous. I had them, we moved to Rochester after I finished the story. I had them in the trunk of my car. My car was stolen. It was not that. But a young Washington Post reporter got wind of it and became convinced that the Army officials had somehow done this and kept calling me, wanted this to be his Bob Woodward moment. I was like, no, it wasn't the Army, trust me. but there's all crazy stories about the EMP report. And it just reminded me just what, again, not to the level when I read of the records, because he was going to people, the acknowledgments just jumped out at me here because he would go to people who were prominent characters, and they would have in their garage, boxes upon boxes upon boxes of Love Canal files that they just kept, that they hadn't done anything with. And I actually wanted to ask them, say, did they give them to you? Did you have to copy them or what? And questions that you have as a reporter, like, who paid? But he got better advances than I did, I'm sure. And it was just, and maybe the people realized the significance of what they were going through, that they saved all that stuff. But just the records that so many people gave him, which became this sort of backbone of this book that I've talked about. We don't have a lot of time. So any questions? Any questions?
Let me grab the mic.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Dean. If not, I'll prattle on, but please, I don't want to take all the time.
Back here.
So what became of Debbie and Lois? Where's Love Canal today?
Well, ultimately it was resolved. It was kind of emptied finally of everything that was there that was bad. I don't know if, to be honest, I don't know if the building is right straight on Love Canal now. I know there's a building that has gone back there now, some homes again, etc. After they were convinced everything had been purged that was bad. Lois Gibbs, I know in the book here, she's sadly, I think this led to a divorce for her, the strains of the family and all. But she became sort of very active in environmental movements of other kind. So I'm not seen this TV movie that was made of her at the time, but I know there was one that was.
I drove up to Love Canal with my sister a few years ago. It was probably 8 years ago now, because we were curious with a friend who is a Buffalo native. And there's some abandoned houses there that are still there. Everything was raised except for some houses, and there's still some people living in their houses from there who never wanted to sell them and never gave them up. So a handful of those, a handful abandoned ones, everything else is gone. But they did rebuild on the other side of one of the main streets, and they call it Black Creek neighborhood or something.
Yeah, they didn't want the name.
They didn't want the name, but I still don't know that I'd be living on the other side. They put some big, over the main areas of the disaster, they redid this big concrete encapsulation thing to try to contain all of the poison. But with the water flowing through, you're never going to be able to.
And, when they're cleaning it out, there's big parts of the book when they are sort of responding by cleaning it out before they bought them out and telling the neighbors that, we'll get this clean and everything will be resolved. Or stuff is blowing up and things. It's just it's crazy. It's fires. They want, and you pity the poor workers that got this task of cleaning this place out. Because they've been told, you'll be okay, but it's sad. So, and it's not, as the book makes clear. It was the most prominent publicly of the ones we know, but it wasn't the one. You mentioned I have daughters. My youngest daughter is an environmental engineer and was working. She's actually a nature conservator now, but she was working private contractor for a while. And they have a Superfund project with a town in Montana, Libby, Montana, which at one point they thought about taking the whole town down because it was a town where, before the threats of asbestos was really known, they dug up this whole area and it was asbestos laden, and they put the stuff the football field was, basically became the soil for the football field. And it was used in building structures and all. Every year now they go back, they've been testing and doing remediation throughout. But every year they go back and go to houses and try to make sure everything's okay with tests. And she spent 6 months living in Montana. It was really interesting because it was this whole anti-government sort of stance, and meanwhile, the government was the one that was basically saved the community, through the EPA Superfund. But everybody had this sort of don't tread on me, but make sure you clean up my house. Anyway.
I thought it was also interesting in the book, you're talking about the government, the number of names you hear that still are government officials today, and how you see how they've moved up sort of the chain, and there was the whole thing, the whole Al Gore thing, his first interest in environment. It was just interesting to see some of their more meager beginnings.
Yeah, and it was interesting Governor Kerry, who of course is central here, was a central figure with Attica, post-Attica, and LaFalce, whom I was actually happy to read that at least his staff was trying to do the right thing. And I don't think he wasn't. He was just up against, couldn't get the whole Congress to move. Because I always, I didn't do a lot of reporting on him when I first got here, but I know he was pretty well respected and liked. So he comes out pretty well in the book, I think, or at least his staff does.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That was a great talk. I just became aware of this book existing, so I have not read it yet, but I actually worked at the Niagara Gazette about 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And so I guess my question is about the fact-checking aspect and like the preservation of material. So I'm not, I'm basically an editor of books now, and as far as fact-checking goes, what would you say like a fact-checker would have to do? Is it essentially like re-reporting all of the, all the reportage?
To a degree, I mean, you have this roadmap because you have the author telling you, here's the document, and I'm sure he in his cases, probably electronically sending it, saying, here's the document for this fact, this fact, this fact. And, this is, what, the New Yorker, of course, is notorious for its fact-checking, this sort of, and that's kind of what it is. I mean, it's not to the same degree where you're having to do the interviews, you're probably taking, I don't know if he's providing the interview notes to the editor or not. Sometimes they do that, sometimes not. But I would bet a lot of it is just checking out the documentation to make sure it aligns with what he's reported. Yeah, that's a big undertaking. You're right. It's a huge one.
The University of Buffalo has a pretty big archive for the whole Love Canal activity. Diane wants me to say something. I was a chemical engineer at DuPont in 1978 as an intern, and I started working there on January 2nd, 1979. So I was there during the whole Love Canal activist activity. And I'm pretty familiar with all those chemicals. I was well aware of Hooker's representation across the country, decided not to work for them. But actually Love Canal, before it was disturbed, was one of their better disposal sites.
Oh, that's fascinating.
From an engineering perspective, they did everything they could at the time for best practices, which was unusual, frankly, for Hooker, compared to what they did down in New Jersey and Harlem.
Yeah, that's talked about briefly here.
But they were there for a long time, and their history includes mustard gas creation back in World War I. So were they part of the successful war effort or not? We could debate that. Right? But they were a critical Defense Department supplier going back a long time there. But the critical thing for me that was not answered in the book, and I could not find, and I tried a little bit to go through the archives, is where did you're an investigative reporter. Did you ever, they didn't follow the money.
That's true.
The way this started was the city needed new housing. And they sent notices that they wanted to condemn the property, which is why Hooker sold it to them. Okay. And we were aware of all that, those of us around there, but I couldn't find it in the archives. I didn't really go into the Niagara Gazette archives, but there was a lot of money involved. The building of Griffith Park and the building of those bungalows. They needed lower cost housing, but it wasn't cheap back then. The factory workers back then at that time were making $11 to $13 an hour. That may not sound a lot now, but I was a starting engineer and I was making $9.50. Okay, so in general, most of those workers living in those places were making more money than I was. I lived in Tonawanda. But for the most part, it wasn't really low income besides Griffith Park. And those people may not have the cash to move out, but a lot did. And some of the women that worked with those kids were actually employees at the factory. And I was the OSHA and RECRA engineer at the time. So they talk about going to Kentrol and done some stuff in the book. Well, I actually followed the truck left our factory.
Wow.
And not dumping on the side of the road, which was happening back then too.
Yeah, I guess a couple points. Yeah, I mean, it seemed as if Hooker, and correct me because I could be wrong, it seemed as if Hooker became a company that, like so many, starts off doing things right, and whether it's cost cutting or whether it's the volume with which they're operating. You know,
Only at Love Canal.
Yeah.
They actually had a pretty bad reputation.
Oh, okay.
So when Occidental got them, Arm and Hammer didn't help.
Yeah, no, Occidental. That's a friend of mine, Steve Weinberg, who used to be reporter, director of investigative reporters and editors, and actually wrote a really great biography on Arm and Hammer. The money part, you're right. I mean, the sort of the money flow is their campaign contributions, things like that. They can explain it. You're right. I have not seen that. Where the money does arise, and I think he describes it very well in the book, is just the unwillingness by the government to spend money it has. And it's,
It didn't have much back then.
Exactly, they didn't. It was really a tough time. There's so many demands. And you've got this thing happening. So to that part, there's kind of a follow the money, which is different than sort of following the corporate money and seeing if there's something nefarious going on there. Which it may just be that there wasn't. But
Well, I was actually more interested in, and I don't know if anybody lived or worked around Niagara Falls.
I did.
Okay.
I did as a young girl.
Oh, okay.
This was like 20 years before.
Right,
Yeah.
but that would be about the time that it would be very interesting to follow the money for the people that built the bungalows at River
Yeah.
Park and the developers and how they were in with all the government, local government at the time. Because I have not found that story. Yeah, I looked for it, and Google it most.
and the local government was clearly very cushy with yeah.
Hooker never got sued for liability. They only got sued for cleanup.
Yeah, they paid a lot.
120 million at the time. But
Oh yeah, that's true.
it's
It's probably the inflationary cost you see
Right.
now in the book. True.
Yeah, but and there was a lot of money for cleanup, but they never nobody could hook them for liability because of all the liability that was on the state.
Mhm.
And and you lived there. The number one thing that caused that canal to really fail was when they put that expressway in Nowhere.
They put, I'm sorry, what? They did
The
what?
expressway to Nowhere.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Because it was envisioned as this kind of model community in the beginning.
No, that happened much later than the
Yeah.
model community.
Okay.
I forget what they call it, Coleman Boulevard, Connemara Expressway.
Mhm.
That changed the whole hydrology of and it caused the cap.
I think I moved before that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I just remember the stink.
Oh, yeah.
I just
Yeah, I mean, I drove by that often.
I lived about 20 blocks away from there.
Yeah.
Wow. No, thanks for that. That's really illuminating. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. We've reached 1 o'clock. Fascinating topic. Thank you so much, Gary. Appreciate it.